So, go ahead. This will be fairly informal, given that your opponent declined to join us. But
I scared him off, didn't I?
Yeah. No, I think you intimidated him rather.
I did, yes. No, actually, I've only met him once. I was at a Republican event recently, and he did not seem very communicative, and I don't mean that as pejoratively. I mean, we just didn't talk too much. There are a lot of other people there, so
sure.
I didn't get to know him. And someone told me he dropped out, but I don't think that was the case. But anyway, I haven't seen him at other events, so I don't know what he's doing.
We're happy to have you here.
Well, thank you.
Why don't you introduce yourself to us and the viewers at home, and just tell us a little bit about why you're running. And this is House District, remind me. I'm sorry.
Yes, District 28.
District 28. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the parameters of District 28, where it lies, and why you're running?
It's the eastern line is essentially I-5, although it stretches up to Clay Street in the Portland State area. It includes a little bit of Portland State. The northern boundary is roughly Highway 26 up to the point where it meets Shoals Ferry and the extension of Shoals Ferry on a northern line, which I was told by the elections, Multnomah County elections folks, that it runs right through tax lots. Apparently not designed with a great deal of care, but whatever the case. So Shoals Ferry down to, if you know where the Red Tail, it goes down to Hall Boulevard, and then Hall Boulevard is essentially the southern boundary. Okay. So it incorporates Multnomah County and a portion of Washington County.
Great. Tell us about yourself.
My name is Patrick Castles. I was born and raised in this state. I love Oregon and want to make it better. I have a wife and 3 children. The youngest one is still going to school at Oregon State here.
About what year?
She's a junior this year. She'll be a senior next year. And she's going to get married later this year, we're thinking.
Oh, yeah.
She's picked a date, but we're not sure. That's between her and her fiance, they're not very communicative with us where and when and all that. So bringing relatives in is developing into a problem for us. But I have a degree, Bachelor of Science degree with the University of Oregon, and a master's with Portland State, both in political science. So that's kind of a rundown of my background. My mother was French.
Oh, really?
From France.
Where?
Saint-Denis, which is in the northern suburbs of Paris.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take up your time, but there's actually a very romantic story about how my parents met in World War II. So.
Was your father in the service over there?
Yeah, he was in the service. He was staff sergeant, and you would think that would be, and he is essentially an office manager, would be his counterpart title in the private business area. But lest you think it was safe, while traveling across the channel from England to France, his ship apparently hit a mine and blew up the ship he was on, and other people who were there, other soldiers, and they were all being transported to France. So he proceeded eventually to Paris, where he met my mother rather romantically on the steps of the Sacré-Cœur, which is the big white church on the hill, if you know which one I'm talking about. So they had a whirlwind courtship. He ended up in Berlin, where he was, as I said, a staff sergeant running an office for colonels and generals, people who eventually were the ones organizing Berlin at the end of the war.
Wow. And was he from Oregon?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Born in Oregon City.
So he went over, came back, and brought his French bride home?
And here's the rest of the story. They didn't come over at the same time together. He went through a military route, and she was routed with a lot of other war brides on a ship. And so it was a terrible crossing because you have all these people cooped up in a ship, and they get sick, and she got sick, everybody got sick, and it was pretty miserable. And they got to New York. Oh, I was going to mention that the honeymoon, because it actually might be of slight historical interest to you, in that the military gave them a honeymoon at the Negresco Hotel in Nice, France, which was a 5-star hotel.
Oh my God.
And the reason was that they wanted to get the economy going again in France.
Oh yeah.
So they were doing these little things for their soldiers, and so that was kind of a benefit of that time period for them and their lives. Anyway, my mother said when she hit the Oregon, she took a train from New York, and she said when she hit the Oregon border, she said, "Oh boy, what did I get myself into?" Because all she saw was desert, dry land. But she said she felt better when she got to Portland. It was
green.
It was relief. Yeah, it was relief. So anyway, that's kind of the nuts and bolts of their experience there. She suffered great privation in France because they had had the Depression and then the war. And I mean, my grandfather worked for the gas company there, which was actually kind of a good thing because he was considered important by the Germans. But if they'd caught him bringing a lump of coal back to his apartment, he probably would have been shot right there. So there was a lot of risk and sacrifice that they went through. So I think my mother, and she never said this, but I think she probably felt a lot of relief leaving all of that behind and coming to Oregon, to the United States, which seemed like a much better place to be for her future. And she ended up having 4 boys. So,
and you're
I'm number 1. I remind my brothers all the time.
Sure.
Well,
tell me about your career. What is it you've done for a living?
Well, I was in title insurance for a while, and then I worked for IBM actually, it was an Oregon company that got sold to Bank of America, or it was sold to Merrill Lynch, which was then bought by Bank of America, which then was bought by IBM. So I ended up working for IBM until 2018, when I took my retirement and decided to move on to bigger and better things.
You've run for office before, right?
I did in 2020. And if you're interested, I'll tell you about my little story about how I ended up in District 28, because I ran in District 38 against Andrea Salinas. And
I remember this. I remember I was in the endorsement interview in 2020.
You and an intern, right?
I think that's right. That sounds right.
Anyway, I was in 38, which is essentially Southwest Portland down to Lake Oswego, through Lake Oswego downtown. And so anyway, Andrea Salinas was the point person for the Democrats when they changed the lines.
Yes.
And amazingly, I didn't move, but the line did. And so I found myself in District 28, which is still Southwest Portland. And as I said, extends over to roughly Shoals Ferry on the western boundary.
Well, Salinas is herself discovering that there are political forces larger than her.
That could well be, I'm sure. We actually had a talk after the election was over, and we had a nice little chat, and it was interesting for me to hear. We kind of had a laugh because I was saying, "Well, you did better in my area than and I did better in her area, and vice versa. You know, she did better in my area, and not as well, she thought. Although it wasn't a close race, but it was kind of a funny thing to talk about. Post-election review for both of us. You know.
So, is there an incumbent in 28?
Actually, there is. Dosia Graber.
Oh, yeah.
And she experienced quite a change in her district. She said she lost Tigard when in the short conversation I had with her on Wednesday. It's the only time I've ever met her. But it was at a Beaverton Chamber meeting that everybody was invited to. All the candidates were invited to. So we had a nice little chat, a short one, and then we each got to ask each other a question, and so we had a little experience with each other from the political point of view.
So, tell us why it is you're running. What motivates?
Well, there are so many reasons. There are probably as many reasons as there were bills in the legislature in the last 2 years. But first of all, I'm disturbed by the level of competency which I see in government. Competency, as you know, is important. It's not always talked about in those terms. But one of the things that was really disturbing to me was the event, and I think I mentioned this in the interview with you originally, whereby the state received $86 million to improve the computer system for the employment department. It was actually, the money came from the federal government, the Obama administration. So they had $86 million. So fast forward to 2020, and we have COVID coming in, and people are being shoved out the door, and they can't get they could, first of all, the Trump administration waived the 1 week waiting period, and the computer couldn't handle that. And so we come to find out that they'd spent only $4 million of the $86 million. Of course, $86 million now is worth less than $86 million in 2009 dollars. We discovered that these people who desperately needed the money were not getting it. And through no fault of their own, they were put in a position that they never should have been put in, because that computer system, based on COBOL, which was back in my college days what they used.
Oh yeah.
A very inflexible software system. That just got to be a total mess because they didn't do their job. And
but did you say they only spent how much of the $86 million?
$4 million out of the 86.
They got $86 million in 2009, and they spent $4 before the pandemic hit.
Right. And then Governor Brown fired the person she had hired, I think earlier that year. I don't recall exactly. It was like a year earlier that she'd hired the person to run that department. So she made that person the scapegoat. But she was Secretary of State and did an audit, actually, on this. You could probably look this up. She did an audit, and she didn't make any change. She didn't start the ball again, or she didn't do anything with regard to
this is all true.
You recognize this?
No, he's accurately describing what happened.
Yeah.
It's a complete failure.
So,
catastrophe.
And I could go through one after another of system failures in state government that have really annoyed me as a taxpayer and as a person who has seen so much abuse. You can talk about kids being put up in office buildings or shipped out of state.
You beat me to it. Shipped out of state.
Shipped out of state. Just basically incompetent government. Checks sent out to people who didn't deserve them. Checks not sent out to people who did deserve them. All of this, you just go through a whole history of the last 10 years of monopoly rule by the same incumbents who have not solved these problems and basically seem to ignore any sort of auditing function on people that they make the laws for. So,
Wait, and are you an auditor for, what do you do at IBM?
no, I didn't audit.
Oh, you didn't?
I was in invoice management.
That's it. Okay, sorry, yeah.
So it was, not too exciting either, but
Well, I've become a really big fan of auditing, but go on.
well,
It sounds like you are too.
I am too, and you see, it does get action sometimes, like the city of Portland right
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
There's just been so much that could be done that's much better. They've got tons of money to solve the homeless problem, and where do they go with that? I don't know if they're at square one, but they're pretty close to it. I don't think that they've done their job. But that's what you get with monopoly government. You get a kind of complacency that gets built in. And so that's why I'm running. I'm a Republican. I have a huge disadvantage in registration in my district. But if I do nothing else, I will at least get some word out with regard to how the government is mistreating its citizens by their neglect and sometimes by just not helping people when they should be helped. And, anyway, that's basically my overview of what the state of Oregon has been like the last 10 years. I remember a time, I was actually an intern for Roger Martin, who was legislator, representative from Lake Oswego, and it was very brief as part of my master's work. And so that was my first introduction to the legislature, and there was much more comity between Republicans and Democrats at the time, and so it would be nice if it was restored to that level, but it hasn't been. I brought a little show and tell for you. It's your own magazine, and I got to say, Willamette Week does some really good work, and it sometimes amazes me that sometimes you can endorse people who do this stuff. But just to quote here, this is the paper starting out. Some indicators such as K through 12 test scores, the housing shortage and inadequate provisions of mental health services suggest the state remains deeply troubled. And then a paragraph later, it describes what a former state representative said. We are a high-tax state with low services, adds former state representative Jules Bailey, Democrat of Portland, who was endorsing, it was about Reed, but shit's not working, she said.
I remember that's a great quote.
I think Jules has hit the nail on the head.
Well, you asked me why I was running. You could just pull example after example, and I use Willamette Week as a source for a lot of my information. I have filing cabinet and messes and everything that you might imagine.
Are you sort of a Mark Hatfield Republican? Have you been a Republican all your life?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. Well, I always supported him in that sense. I guess I would be, but probably more on the conservative side. To be honest with you, I'm not trying to pose as a radical leftist. I'm simply
but
trying to make my state better.
When you talked about comedy, I thought, I just was reading a piece. I'm fascinated with him. I mean, he was an evangelical who was against prayer in schools. He was a veteran who voted against defense appropriations, and he always cooperated with Democrats. And there's nobody like him left. I mean, he's gone. I mean, there's no one else in the world like him.
That's true. But I think the world has changed. I don't think it's that Mark Hatfield changed that much through his life. I mean, it's a rational thing to if you've been through a war, it's not irrational to be against war.
Right. But I just don't see anybody who straddles those lines. There's so few people.
No, not really. I think Mitt Romney is the closest one.
Yeah, I think I live it.
So are you closer to Mitt's lane than, say, Trump's lane?
No, I wouldn't describe myself that way. I don't want to be labeled. That's one thing that I really feel uncomfortable about, because I'm not going to seek a lot of endorsements from people who already agree with me on the side. That's not where I don't want to owe anyone anything in terms of a legislative position where I would have to pay somebody back for their support, because it gets really complicated in the legislature when you have to deal with the nuances of a particular bill. Sometimes it's clear cut, sometimes it's not. So you have to just kind of work through what's best. To continue the theme that I was working on, you can see how devastating the forest fires were, and I'm still not seeing any progress being made in terms of forestry and improving forestry practices. There was actually a Native American, I think he was employed by the state. He said, "Why don't you let Native Americans do this?" He's down in Klamath Falls. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, why not? Why not? Because they have a lot of history in that. Give it a try, see if it works. But that's not the answer that you're ever going to get out of a legislature. And I'm not saying that because he's Native American, except for the fact that there may be some knowledge that in practices that works best for people down in that part of the state. Because an urban legislator probably should not be telling people down in Klamath Falls how to run Klamath Falls in ways that don't involve the state generally, where you would have a responsibility to talk about things. But anyway, that's another one of those failings that I think that is disturbing. I got to say, it's not anything new. I can remember when I was a kid, my father would take us to Seaside by car, and every time we go through the Tillamook Burn, point out the Tillamook Burn, which is, I think, in 1948. Fire's going to be part of Oregon as long as we have wood and summers and lightning and people. It's always going to be there, but our response to it, I think, can be improved maybe with local teams that go immediately to a problem area, maybe better views of the forest by satellite that might trip off some of these local units that can get to the burn. And I forget it had a well-known name at the time, but one of the burns, it was small and it could have been put out, and it led to a bunch of other, because one fire leads to another as the ash flies, as the sparks fly, as the Bible says.
I was going to say, it's the Bible.
Yeah. So, yes, I think we could talk about that. I think we can talk about improving mental health and homelessness by pulling together the different parts of government that don't seem to work together. I have a big vision for that. I don't know whether I can put all those things together by myself. I don't think it's possible, but I think that's part of the problem, is that you have all these disparate boxes, and everybody has their own silo, and that's one of the reasons why Portland is still fumbling, even though it has a tremendous amount of money available to it. That's why Portland is fumbling around for answers and not dealing with the problem. Everybody has their own ideas, and they can't. There's no strong leader to galvanize the situation into progress for the people who are living in tents and people who are not living in tents, who don't want to live in an unhealthy environment. So.
Do you have a sense of how you and your opponent in this primary differ? Is there an area where you create?
Well, as I said, I just talked to him once, very shortly. I did have. I did print out his something.
I looked at some. He doesn't have a lot of stuff.
He's probably not really running.
Yeah.
No, I've got his voters pamphlet here, and it says, "We'll fight to rein in crime. I will fight to rein in homelessness. I will fight to empower parents," and oh, that's fine. And I will tell you that we only have, if you don't know, 325 words to fill in. And that includes the top portion where occupational background, educational background, all that counts to the 325. And since I'm a bit of a writer, 325 is very confining for me. So I didn't mention that I wrote a book, so I've written a book. And
What's your book about?
it's science fiction. It's not of a political nature.
Okay, that makes me more interested.
Yeah, right?
Well, briefly, you want my elevator speech?
The elevator pitch.
Elevator.
I don't need the full chapter by chapter, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it's about an exploratory team of people from Earth who land on a planet called Mara, M-A-R-A. The title of the book is Legend of Mara. And one of the protagonist is an architect, or not an architect, archaeologist, and he's studying this sign that he's seen on a piece of a rock or something that he's found. And he's kidnapped and taken to another planet. He just disappears. And this happens 37 other times. And they all end up in another planet, but they escape from the people who kidnapped them, a different species, all that. And they escape in a rocket and lands at the third planet. So they're absolutely naked because, and that's one of the reasons why you want to read this, to find out why they are naked. Because there was a reason. There was a reason. But they are taken to this planet and they have to start all over again. So there's a kind of question: what would it be like if everybody had to start over? You could think about a nuclear war, where it'd be the same scenario, where everything would be wiped out, and except you'd have your clothes on, presumably. But anyway, the story's divided into three parts, and that's the first part, how they explore their planet. The second is a short story about and how they reinvent the wheel and fire, and the second is about how paper becomes important and the people who are there in the different parts of the new locations, actually an island on a water planet. And then the third story is about explaining why all this happened and the progress that was made over 500 years. And then they developed this sense of revenge, at least the president of the country which is developed. And they develop interstellar travel, and they go to this other planet, partly with the idea of revenge over the kidnapping that took place of the original 38 people. So that's kind of a long elevator speech. It's like that from the 105th floor, but that's the gist of it.
All right. Well, we have limited time to get back to write this story.
Yeah.
But I do want to make sure that you've had a chance to tell us a few things about what you would look like in office. So can you tell me what your first bill would be?
My first bill, probably I would be looking at transparency in government. And that came up actually. I don't know if he probably doesn't remember the question. We each got a question of our opponent. I asked Andrea Salinas, do you disagree with anything that Kate Brown has done? And
could she name a place? I feel like she had a hard time doing that.
No, she said, well, we had a hard time getting information out of the governor's office. And she couldn't name a bill because she voted for everything that Brown advocated. So, and in fact, she was involved in that well-known situation on the PERS legislation where she and Mitch Greenlick were taken into the back room in the middle of a vote, into the anteroom by Tina Kotek, and because they were going to vote against the bill, and something happened back there, and they changed their opinion.
Yeah,
it's just absolutely amazing how persuasive Tina can be. Anyway, they came out and they voted for what was for them a difficult PERS bill.
All right. I'm going to ask unless you have more.
Oh, no. No, I think I'm getting a sense of the issues that concern you most. I guess the homeless. Can you give us just the specifics on what you would do on homelessness?
Well, as I said, you need to bring together all the organizations.
Right. Is it
probably? Well, you could even have like a cabinet level position for this particular issue. So you bring together mental health and people familiar with psychology and people. And part of the problem, and I got to tell you, I have a fairly liberal psychologist friend who disagrees with me on this, but I say you got to bring them in and you got to put them someplace. You just can't let people spread out around the city. You have to put them in one place. Sam Adams' idea of putting 3 different locations, to me, was at least a reasonable solution, just so you can get people into one location where you can provide services there. But they've done very little to solve that problem with the dispersion all over the city. And it may come down to arresting people the old-fashioned way if they're breaking the law. Just to bring them in, you can say, well, we'll expunge it after a successful 5-year program or something like that. But something else has to work besides the way we're approaching it now. You've got the county, they want to build $250,000 condo units for everybody, for all the thousands of people out there, which is not a practical solution. The last one will be long gone before they ever get that accomplished. There's been kind of they put them in these little homes that you see from time to time, but they're still dispersed all over the city. And if you have to bring them in together where the services are, and it's not going to happen unless you either force them to by vagrancy laws, or if you put them in pods like Sam Adams suggested, like the 3 pods. I'm not particular about it, but the problem is not being solved today. So.
Okay.
And I see that reflected in Willamette Week's frustrations. As I said, you do a great job of identifying the problem, but that's still apparently not enough. The Oregonian does too, oddly enough. Tribune not so much, but every now and then they say something intelligent.
Well, we appreciate it. We have a fun question every cycle. Fun question this time is, after 2 years of pandemic, was there a moment when you felt a sense of joy or relief at seeing people's faces again, at returning to normal, at getting to go back into the grocery store, whatever it is? I the other day went to a diner down the street and I sat at the counter for the first time in 2 years, and it just felt like being back to normal a little bit.
I love that feeling when it happens.
Yeah.
Greeting you today was a little bit like that, because I wasn't sure, because you'd asked for my COVID card. And so I wasn't sure whether I should have brought a mask, so I brought a mask just in case.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, it's not, the line is not firmly there, because I sing in a church choir, and right now we're still using masks when we sing. We can take them off when we're not singing.
But you take them off when you're not singing.
Yeah, we can take them off when we're not singing, but because you're taking deeper gulps of air and there's more output. And the very first people in the local area, they're actually up in Washington. It was a choir.
Yeah, that was one of the first super spreader events.
Yeah, and a couple of people died out of that choir. So that really spooked our choir director. He didn't want anybody to die, and I understand that. In fact, we weren't even in the building during church services for quite a while. So it's still a process, and I think we're at the end of the process. I hope we're at the end of the process. But actually, going to church without having to wear a mask, you're not required to. Some people still do, but you're not required to in the congregation. So when we're not singing, in fact, he just got over this deal where he was going to have 4 people in each section sing. The others would sit out, and they'd rotate back and forth just to keep people away from each other. So the answer is yes. Every time I walk into Fred Meyer's, every time I go to church, every time I greet a neighbor, it feels much better. It's not a normal condition for human beings.
It's
No,
not.
not at all.
And I'll give you another specific example. I would take masks off of children. There is no justification for having masks on children, and there are reasons, medical reasons for not keeping masks on children. I think it's the teachers' union. I think they drive this state, and I think that's another area where I'm particularly unhappy because one union or one business or Intel or Nike should not be running the state for its own benefit. It should be run for the benefit of all the people, for the most people that we can't satisfy all the people all the time, but for the most people that we can satisfy within the reasonable expectation that the best medicine will prevail in a state where it's always a controversy, where everything is a controversy.
Yeah.
But anyway, I experience it all the time. And
Good.
I'm glad that you've got your mask
Yeah.
on too.
Mr. Castle, it's a pleasure to meet
Yeah.
you.
Well,
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
Yeah.